Dear friends, I'm back again with all of you. Deepak Chopra here with the CEO of the Chopra Foundation, Poonacha Machaiah. Poonacha, say hi to everyone.
Hello, hi everyone.
And then we have two very special guests, James Arbib. James, say hi to our audience,
Hi
please.
there.
And Tony Seba. Tony, say hi to, you'll be speaking ultimately to 15 million people here. So thank you for joining us. And what I want to start off with is both Punacha and I have read your monograph, Rethinking Humanity, Five Foundational Sector Disruptions, the Life Cycle of Civilizations, and the Coming Age of Freedom. So a little bit of history from the two of you. Maybe Tony, you can start with that, and James, you can add to it, and then we shoot the breeze after that.
Yeah. So Jamie and I are co-founders of a think tank called Rethink X, where we analyze technology disruption and its implications for society. Before that, I've had a long career in technology, Silicon Valley. I've started several companies. I'm an early employee at companies like Cisco Systems in the mid 90s that went on to build the internet and RSA data security and so on. And over the last 20 years or so, I've been working, I've been teaching, educating, and studying disruption, the process of disruption at all levels, whether it's product, sector, society. And that's actually how Jamie and I met. And I'll let you talk about that, Jamie.
Yeah, so I mean, Tony and I met maybe 5 years ago or so, and it was, I mean, it was a profound meeting for me, at least. And we were both invited along to talk to a US military think tank in Washington, who were exploring a scenario of a rapid energy transition. They were really asking the question, you know, what does it mean for geopolitics if we get off fossil fuels very quickly? And they invited 10 experts along to brief them. And 8 of those experts were from kind of big businesses, big oil companies, from major consultants, from departments of government, and so on and so forth. And all 8 of them had almost identical forecasts for the adoption of solar photovoltaics and for the adoption of electric vehicles and so on. And there are all these kind of low, straight line, incremental forecasts out to 2040, and actually in some cases 2050. Very low levels of adoption, even by 2050. And I'll never forget, because Tony got up after hearing sort of 5 or 6 of these and said, look, you know, that's not how disruption works. You know, it's not slow and linear. You know, it's rapid and non-linear. It's an S curve. That's the S curve we get in all technology disruptions. And that's kind of driven by I guess the feedback loops, the accelerators of change that kick in as you know, products and services begin to be adopted. And he said, you know, this is over by the 2030s. We'll have a fully renewable energy system. We'll have you know, 100% electric and autonomous vehicles driving on our roads. And if you guys are making your plans based on these forecasts, you know, you're going to make some major mistakes. And I got up afterwards and I basically said, look, you know, I agree with Tony. And you know, the two of us went for coffee afterwards, and we were discussing kind of healthcare and finance and food production and pretty much every sector of the economy. And you know, the idea we had was that you know, we're on the cusp of a major disruption of each of these sectors, a fundamental transformation of the model of production. And yet no one seems to see it. You know, we don't have any idea of the kind of scale of change that's coming, because essentially we're using these faulty modeling methodologies. You know, we're essentially treating what is a very complex economy and system as a simple system. We kind of break down that complexity and extrapolate kind of straight lines into the future. And we decided after, you know, several coffees and several discussions over a few months, we had no choice but to set up the think tank that became Rethink X, because no one else was providing the kind of information that we think that decision makers across society, whether they're politicians or business leaders or investors or indeed anyone else within society, you know, needs in order to take rational decisions about the future. So that's kind of the background to Rethink X. And from the outset, we wanted to write the book, Rethinking Humanity, about, how these changes at a sector level, kind of interact with each other, and how the effects are going to cascade and change every element of society. But we felt that to get there, we had to do some individual sector analyses to show how fundamentally, some individual sectors could be transformed, to have the kind of the depth of research that sits behind it. And so we've written papers on the transportation sector, we've written on food and agriculture, we've written on the energy sector. But Rethinking Humanity is really about how these major transformations of pretty much every sector of our economy are going to kind of catalyze extraordinary possibilities. On the one hand, for us to kind of rise up into a really, a new age, an age that's unconstrained by scarcity, that's unconstrained by the kind of limitations that we have, a major breakthrough where essentially we can solve poverty, we can solve climate change, we can solve inequality. Those things aren't in conflict anymore, that solving one affects the others. But there's also a major risk. I mean, this is not kind of techno-utopianism, because there's a major risk that we get it wrong, that that our failure to understand the kind of complexity and the processes of change means that we don't make the adaptations necessary, and that we collapse. And actually, that's been the history of prior civilizations. Pretty much every civilization before, in fact, every civilization before that's broken through and had the kind of, order of magnitude growth that we've had, reaches its limits and collapse. They lose their adaptability, their ability to kind of think outside their current system, and they fall over. And I think what we're trying to say is, look, it's in our hands. It's our choice. We can see it. We're not, we have for the first time in history, we have the power to understand where we might go and the choices we're facing, and we can choose which direction to travel.
So that's a very good summary of where you are, Jim and Tony. But before I ask Poonacha to say a few words about his background in technology and where we can go together, I just want to say a few words about disruption, because it's something that is of great interest to me from a philosophical point of view and also from a consciousness point of view. And so about 20 years ago, I started having conversations on disruption with a physicist, a quantum physicist called Amit Goswami. And he now lives between Oregon and India. He's a physicist. He was a professor of physics. But he's also very aware of a deeper understanding of how consciousness operates. So I just want to share what he and I spoke about 20 years ago and how that has blossomed into this conversation, actually. So according to Vedanta, which is one of the ancient wisdom traditions of the East, which gave rise to Kashmir Shaivism and Buddhism and all that, disruption exists in the space between every thought. Disruption exists in the space between every thought, and the space between every thought is entangled in our experience with our perceptions, our emotions, our feelings, our imagination, and our creativity. So that particular little gap between thought is called pure consciousness in Eastern wisdom traditions. And pure consciousness has the following five qualities. Number one, it's a realm of infinite possibilities. And by infinite possibilities means nothing is excluded. Infinite means infinite. Number two, it's a realm of pure creativity. Number three, it's a realm of pure uncertainty and unpredictability, because without pure uncertainty and unpredictability, there's no pure creativity. You have to have both going together. Number four, it's also a realm of non-local correlation. Everything is connected to everything else. And actually, everything is inseparable from everything else. So it's synchronicity is also part of that. And it is the source of attention and intention, which are the drivers of disruption. Attention and intention. Wherever your attention goes, you bring energy to it. And intention, of course, is you want to transform an old story into a new story. So disruption really involves what you were just saying, death and resurrection. But the death has to be complete. It's not just innovating an old story. It's not putting new wine in old bottles. It's new wine and new bottles all together. So it's a new story, it's a new context, it's a new understanding of relationships, and it's a new story. The old story is dead and the new story is born. Okay, this is what it means in religious traditions also to be born again, or the virgin birth. They're all connected as metaphors. So we're talking about something very profound that's happening in society today. Because if it doesn't happen, at least I am very sympathetic to those who are saying that if it doesn't happen, we're ready for extinction. We have mechanized death, we have atomic bombs, we have biological warfare, we have cyber warfare, we have racism, we have bigotry, we have hatred, we have prejudice, we have a history of slavery and colonialism, we have the ability to destroy this planet 17 times over, if not more. And it's a surprise that with the technologies we have, including smartphones, that somebody hasn't attempted this. Somebody hasn't basically interfered with pacemakers or respirators or the food chain or electricity in a city. This thing I'm holding in my hand, as you so elegantly point out in your book, has more computing power than the mainframe computer that sent men to the moon, housed in MIT. So this is divine, but it's also diabolical. And what we are saying right now is that unless we really disrupt, or at least try, then humanity may be headed for extinction. Last extinction was 65 million years ago, and it was dinosaurs were wiped out in 1 hour because of the meteorite that fell on our planet, which was the equivalent of an atomic bomb. But now we have 20 times that capacity. So the fact that you are disrupting and telling a new story through these five drivers of disruption and a new civilization is very significant. People need to wake up to this, and if they don't, we might as well go to the bar and get drunk. Okay, there's nothing else to do. So, with that, Poonacha, you and I have been working at the Chopra Foundation on many things, particularly humanitarian efforts, but also technology, also AI and artificial intelligence and deep learning systems, looking at the microbiome of existence on our planet, talking to photobiologists about the next disruption in the food chain, but also in information technologies. So, why don't you say a few words and then let's go back to the five drivers that both James and Tony are speaking about.
Let's first of all, Tony and James, thank you. This is kind of really, I'm kind of preparing for this meeting. I was rethinking my life. I started off my career very earlier on in 98, 99 in Nortel Networks. It was the intersection of optical networks called Wings of Light. We thought optical is going to rule the world. People don't know much about Nortel today because it went wireless. And the world went wireless. And Tony, you said you were in Cisco. I was very much, very involved in the IoT, IoE. Nortel was made a decision between buying Cisco or another company. Then buy Cisco. Then I went and joined Motorola, and a lot of people don't know Motorola today, because we thought making a phone call was the most important thing. Minor detail: Apple thought making a phone call is not going to be that important. Right? Motorola almost doesn't exist. So I saw this kind of intersection and kind of what Deepak taught, death and resurrection, right, of technologies. So reading your book on the age of freedom, and the whole section of Age of Freedom 3.0 of humanity really struck a chord, because at the foundation we look at 4 pillars: physical well-being, mental well-being, community and social well-being, and then planetary well-being. And so looking at your foundational sectors, I'm really, really interested, and I kind of want to ask you some questions towards the end of this call about information and communication, right? Your thoughts on precision food, food as software. I think these are fundamental, I would say, game-changing thoughts. And Tony, looking at your work and energy, really fascinated to see what is the future of green hydrogen, right? What are some of these fundamental disruptions we can kind of look at? So really excited about the conversation. And I think for us, for me personally, I'm looking at the foundation is the intersection of technology and well-being. And we talk about the network effect and then the node. I think that's really critical in the new economy.
So take it from there, guys. 5 drivers of civilization.
Mhm.
Tony, you can start, and James, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I'll give an overview actually of some of our findings. What we studied was, or what we've been studying for a couple of decades, is the process of change in human civilization, the process of disruption. We started at the sector level. I started at the product level, then sector, then civilization. It turns out that the processes are what's called self-similar. So there are similar processes that work for, change and disruption at the product level, sector level, humanity level, right? Because all of these things are human constructs. And so what we have is long periods of equilibrium, long can be 1,000 years in Sumer, or 100 years today. And then there is a convergence of factors. And what we studied was the convergence of technologies, which, and more than anything in these 5 foundational sectors. And what we found was that when there is such a convergence, a perfect convergence, if you will, a 10x convergence, a couple of things happen. One is that it opens up a vast new possibility space immediately, but we can't all see it. And that's a topic for another conversation, right? But vast new possibility space opens up for good and bad, for collapse, and also for breakthrough. And it happens every single time at every level. So when that, say in transportation, opens up, then entrepreneurs who see it, who do see it, and folks who have wide open eyes can see it. And they rush in to start companies, to invest in new companies and so on. But the mainstream does not see it. The mainstream is still in that, in that linear world and stuck in the past and so on. And then at some point, all those products and services and that are developed by these entrepreneurs rupture the system. Essentially at some point, because in any equilibrium, there are forces for change and forces for stability, brakes and accelerators. But when that system ruptures, then essentially the forces for change, break through, and the old collapses and the new hopefully breaks through, right? And that is the pattern of change and disruption in transport, in information, in energy, in food. We have seen it many times over the last 10,000 years and even before. So convergence, rupture, divergence. And divergence means a vast new possibility space. And then entrepreneurs rush in, and innovators and so on, to capture the possibilities. And that's the beauty, that it is what you say in many cases, infinite possibilities. But if we can't see those possibilities, we can't take advantage of them. We can't capture them. And it happens as S-curves quickly. And interestingly, disruptions are brought in by outsiders from the edge. So incumbents don't enable disruptions for obvious reasons. And that happens at every level, product, sector, and civilizations. But it's folks from the outside, from the edge, who see it, who make the adaptations necessary and capture those possibilities.
So you guys have spoken about 5 basic disruptors right now, 5
Yes.
foundational sector disruptions in the life cycle of civilization. Let's maybe between you and James mention what the major, one or two sentences, what is the major disruption in each of these five?
Okay, well, so let's start with transportation. And, again, it's a convergence that's driving this. So it's a convergence of electric vehicles, driven largely by lithium-ion batteries, and of autonomy, artificial intelligence that can drive the car, and of a new business model, ride hailing. And together they enable what we call transportation as a service, essentially robo-taxis. And the cost of that form of transport will be, a fraction of the cost of private ownership. These cars will be used all the time. They'll last far longer than existing cars do, because there are no moving parts. There's no friction there. And so we'll get to a point actually where we think transport will be free. We think new business models will emerge that provide some other form of monetization that allows, we use the example of a Starbucks on wheels in our transport report. The idea that Starbucks will give you free Wi-Fi to get you in to have a coffee, because information and communications have become so cheap. They might do the same with transportation, because it will be so cheap. So that's going to drive a rapid disruption, and that'll have profound consequences. The other point about disruption is that you get these cascading consequences of change, and they ripple out across other sectors, other parts of society, and it'd be transformation. Tony, do you want to pick the next one?
Sure, and just to complement that, Jamie. When the internal combustion engine, when the car disrupted the horse, right? It was a telling moment, and we're at that moment again, right? Because transport as a service is disrupting the car. But if you look at mainstream analysis, linear analysis, they think of it as a one-to-one kind of substitution, right? They thought of the car as a faster horse, but it was anything but. I mean, the car transformed everything in the 20th century, where we live, how we date, how we mate, how we work, everything. So this is the cascading ripple effects across all of society. Geopolitics in the 20th century basically was about oil, which came out of this disruption. So there are, dramatic cascading ripple effects from these, 10x foundational sector disruptions. So another one that's basically started is energy. So we've done work on solar, wind, batteries, and so on. And our conclusion is that the combination of solar, wind, and batteries, which a lot of folks say that cannot scale, cannot meet 100% of our needs, and so on, will so disrupt the existing, centralized mode of, energy, that over the next 10 years, not 100 or 30, the combination of solar, wind, and battery will not only generate or can generate 100% of our energy needs, but it'll be the cheapest possible system. And on top of that, it will generate so much more additional energy, anywhere from 100 to 300% more energy than the current system generates, for free. For free. I mean, it's essentially zero marginal cost energy. So we are entering a world of superabundance of energy, nearly free energy, that we have never had before. And on top of that, we like to say that 100% solar, wind, and batteries, we call it SWB, is just the beginning. Because once you get to 100%, we found that an additional 20% investment can return 200% more energy. We have never seen that before. I mean, there is no way that any form of resource-based energy can compete with that. So transportation will be wiped out, and over the next 10 years, energy will also be wiped out. And notice that the new system will provide us with a lot more miles, a lot more kilowatt hours for 10 to 100 times less waste and nearly free. So nearly free transport, nearly free energy. Want to take it away with food?
Yeah, well, I might just add to your description of energy, Tony, because it goes to Deepak's point. I mean, this is what we call a phase change. You know, this is not, as Tony says, a one-for-one substitution. This is not, you know, an electric vehicle for a gasoline car. You know, everything changes. You know, the system architecture, the infrastructure, the value chain, the possibilities. I mean, everything in the system changes, and I think that's part of the problem that most people have is in envisaging that. We kind of like to understand that one thing changes, but then we hold all else equal. You know, that's a classic assumption, and that's a very linear and siloed and narrow view. I mean, it can transform everything. So food. I mean, you know, what's going on there is extraordinary in terms of our ability to produce, you know, proteins and other complex organic molecules. And the key technology there is something we call precision fermentation. And that's something that gives us the ability essentially to harness microbes to produce almost whatever we want, any kind of protein or other complex organic molecule. And that's been coming down the most extraordinary cost curve over the last, you know, 3 or 4 decades. We've gone from, you know, $1 billion, you know, when we first produced insulin per kilogram, you know, to $1 million in 2000, down to below $100 today. We're only a handful of years away from getting to below $10, which is about cost parity with bulk proteins. And by the mid 30s, we'll be a fifth, you know, maybe even a tenth of the cost of bulk protein. So that'll disrupt, you know, animal agriculture. But it also gives us, you know, enormous possibilities that animals and animal agriculture just can't meet. We can produce, you know, molecules that you just are too expensive to farm. For instance, we can produce things like human breast milk, which are better quality products, better tolerated by infants. If you think of the marijuana plant, you know, we extract currently a couple of the cannabinoids, you know, THC and CBD. But it's too expensive to extract because the other ones are too scarce. There are 100 or so other cannabinoids, but they're too expensive to extract because they're so scarce in the leaf. But we can now essentially brew those and produce whatever, you know, however much of them we want for very low cost. So, you know, the possibilities are enormous. But again, it represents a phase change. It's a completely different system. What we do today is we grow the whole plant or animal. It's an extraction model, and then we break it down and process it into the things we need. So the cheapest thing to access is the meat, which you can kind of carve off the carcass. The most expensive is the sort of the insulin and the collagen and the whey protein. It has to go through, you know, many processing. But what we're doing now is we're turning it on its head, and it's going from a breakdown model to what we call a build-up model or a creation-based model, where we start with a single molecule or a single cell and we build up products. And that changes the economics, it changes the structure of the market, it changes the dynamics. And this now becomes a much more modular market, a much more distributed market. You know, any area in the world has everything they need to produce as much food as they need. It removes the constraints of water and land use and so on and so forth. It reduces the impact of the weather on our food supplies and so on. It's an extraordinary potential that's emerging there.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Deepak, and what you mentioned about infinite possibilities, which is a theme in our work. You know, we most of our proteins come essentially from 5 animals and 7 crops. But there are millions of proteins in nature. Literally, we don't even know how many there are. And in fact, if you look at how many proteins are possible, I mean, those not just in nature, but proteins that are possible, there are more possible proteins than the number of atoms in the universe by a lot, right? So we could, I mean, this is not just substituting for, a handful of animals and so on. This is infinite. I mean, basically the biggest threat that we see going forward, this lack of imagination, to see this infinite possibility space and create those proteins that are great for us, that for our health, for our thriving, for, and so on. So not just billions of proteins, 10 to the, you name the number. So that is what we're looking forward to. And that is within 10, 15 years. I mean, we're not talking about forever. So that is food. So transport, energy, food, and materials go in the same route. Both with precision fermentation, proteins are a great way to build materials, as we know, and information, which is at the center of all of these disruptions, whether it's AI, food as software. Basically, we're going to make food like we make software, like we edit a video. We have today high school kids doing synthetic biology. High school kids are doing to biology and food and so on what they did 20, 30 years ago with information, with a website, with apps. So if you want to see what's coming in food, just look at what we've seen in the web and smartphones and so on. It's not that difference. So we're going to have global design and development and local production. And essentially, we see that this, in terms of the 5 foundational sectors, we're going to have a lot more than we need. And the cost is going to approach zero over the next couple of decades. We've done the numbers just for these 5 sectors. And for instance, we calculated that the American dream, quote unquote, in terms of what Americans consume in energy, transportation, and food, and housing, and so on, can be had for $250 as a month, as soon as 2030. Right? $250 a month to get everything that we have today, in the leading civilization on Earth today. So, and that means we can solve so many issues: poverty, right? Inequality, resource, conflict, and so on and so forth. All of which are embedded in the current system. And I'll please, Poonacha or Jamie, please add to that.
What
Because
at this point is that we've heard you and all this amazing imagination, thinking, creativity. I'd like Poonacha to weigh in where our work in a way fits in. And then towards the end, I'd like to say a few words about where consciousness fits in, and then see how we can move forward through what social scientists are calling emergence. So let's get there slowly. But Poonacha, you've heard all this now. Where are we relevant in this conversation at all? Because these guys are way ahead.
I was thinking of the App Store. The food will be available on an App Store, right? When you think about global development and locally constructed, locally produced, I can conceive of somebody putting together a recipe on an App Store, a brewery in San Diego producing it, and it's precision, right? It's based, Poonacha showing up, and based on the microbiome, genome sequencing, it'll actually create the best food for me. And I can pick the app, right? Pick this on the App Store. That's my first vision I see happening, right? And I think Tony and James, you guys are kind of leading that. So one of the things I'm thinking about, a couple of thoughts I had, I'll kind of maybe share with you. One is, obviously, we at the foundation are very interested in food, right? And that's because we believe that that can really change the paradigm. But I'm also want to get some clarification from your perspective on build versus breakdown, which I think is central, right? Creation based versus production systems. That's an important paradigm. How do you see, the question I had is that ownership in the age of freedom, right? You basically talk about that those who own the information network will own both the systems of production and the organizing system. How do you see that delicate balance shaping in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the challenges that I think we face and previous civilizations have faced as well, is that we're kind of trapped in our current way of seeing the world. So all the elements of how we understand the world, how we organize the world, all our structures, our political, social, economic systems, we kind of see as fundamental truths. You know, we kind of can't think outside of them. They're deeply embedded, but they're actually just human constructs. And one of the challenges I think we're going to face is that the new paradigm, the new production paradigm that's emerging is just totally different to the old one. I mean, the old extraction-based system is just a kind of bigger scale version of what's existed since the dawn of civilization, really. It's you know, we're trying to harness and extract resources from as wide an area as we can. We can do it at a global scale now, far bigger than anyone else could before. And that's led to, you know, the way we organize our societies, the nation state, you know, you know, the sorts of political, social, and economic systems that we have. But the problem is, if we try and manage this new emerging system through that old industrial era organizing system, we're going to have some real problems. And we're seeing that already. We're already seeing that we've got this, essentially this what we term a creation-based information system, you know, completely distributed, you know, almost zero cost system where we can process and communicate information. It's completely different to the old industrial system, the kind of newspapers and television, a few narrow distribution channels, high cost, high barriers to entry. You could manage that from the center. You could control the flows of information. We can't do that now. You know, it's kind of like the church and state, you know, when they lost control of the flows of information when the printed book came along, you know, they collapsed not long afterwards. I mean, they couldn't exist in that world. And we're seeing that now, that we haven't worked out how to manage that system. We can't regulate, you know, Facebook and Google at a kind of national level. You know, we can, you know, there's an ability now to create misinformation and polarization and affect the outcomes of elections, for instance. And we just don't know how to deal with that. So, you know, these are the big problems we face, and ownership's kind of at the heart of that. That's one of the things. Private ownership of property, you know, capitalism essentially, is at the heart of our current system. And the problem is, in information systems, you know, the old industrial systems, they had economies of scale, right? That was a key economic driver. You got scale and you got an advantage. You know, the new system's all about network effects, and network effects are way more powerful than economies of scale. There's essentially one winner instead of several winners. And the problem with that is that if we try and keep the same ownership models, you know, part of our organizing system, we're just going to see the most extraordinary inequality, the most extraordinary accumulations of wealth by those who own the information networks. And that's really the challenge. We need to develop new models of ownership better suited to this network distributed world. And if we keep trying to manage it through the old world, you know, the kind of inequality we see today is going to be nothing compared to what's coming.
The reason I'm bringing this up, because at the foundation, we have embarked on this whole concept of distributed, you know, trust and ownership are very core to everything we do. So we have partnered with a leading distributed ledger company it's called Hedera Hashgraph. So we actually believe that as you build organizing systems and principles and reward mechanisms, we actually look at a parallel currency. So we are embarked on this currency of well-being as a token of doing good, right? So we're trying to think out of the box. So when all these systems come together, why then rely on the US dollar? Why peg it to a very age-old fiat currency? Why can't we then look at proof of work and look at things like with the distributed ledger and blockchain, look at creating a currency, our own token, we're calling it the love in action. So as you'll imagine this new future rethinking humanity, we believe that doing good and doing well could also be a currency. So I'm looking at from a governing system perspective, very keen to explore this with you guys.
Yeah.
So this is all very helpful. And if I may take a few minutes to see what I'm seeing right now, to share it with you and get your input. So, you know, this COVID-19 thing gave us an opportunity to reflect on our existence, and also an opportunity to re-examine our awareness of existence. For me, that's been a lifelong pursuit. If you go Google, what are the 125 open questions in science today? The first one is, what's the universe made of? And short answer is, we don't know. 96% is dark energy, dark matter, 4% is atomic, only 0.01% is visible, the atomic universe, 0.01%. That includes 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable trillions of planets. Only 0.01% is the visible universe, all of that. And of course, the atomic universe, as we explore it, ends up in waves and particles in mathematical space. So short answer, universe is made of nothing. Second open question in science is, what's the biological basis of consciousness? How does the brain produce consciousness? And that's called the hard problem of consciousness. And Tony and James have both used this phrase, human construct, many times now in this conversation. I am going to take that to one level further. There are many scientists that we work with, Poonacha and I, who are questioning what we call physical reality, that in fact the universe itself is a human construct for modes of knowing and perception in consciousness within a narrow band of human experience. You know, the human perceptual experience is less than 1% of the electromagnetic band that is available for experience. Other species, for example, you know, mice and mammals have similar perceptual activity, but what does the world look like to an insect with 100 eyes, or a bat that moves through the echolocation of ultrasound, or bees that navigate through ultraviolet, etc., etc. So there's a whole group of neuroscientists today who are questioning the very idea that we live in a physical universe, that in fact what we call the physical universe is a human construct for modes of knowing and perception, sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, imagination, creativity, all of that. Given that, and the knowledge that everything that we talk about in the world today is a human construct. Wall Street, money, democracy, nation states, empires, all human constructs. And so let's take it little further. If the universe and the physical body and everything material is a human construct, where does this take us with Rethinking Humanity? So as I was incubating here in my cage in La Jolla during the lockdown, looking out of the window and seeing the ecosystem repair itself, climate change was first time in my consciousness reversible. You could see the Himalayas from 400 miles away. Birds were singing, even in Bangalore. People were breathing better. Fish were returning to their dead lakes, even the canals of Venice. And so it seemed that the ecosystem was repairing itself. In between, the price of oil went to less than $1. So that was also very interesting, that an oil-free economy is possible. Everything that you're saying is possible. And in my mind, I started to see the connection between climate change, social and economic injustice, war, terrorism, mechanized death, extinction of species, and pandemics and financial crises, all as a systemic problem. The old story that you're trying to disrupt. It's a systemic problem. So what you're saying is a systemic change. Can we take it one step further? And this is what I wanted to discuss, and Poonacha can comment, and I'd like you to comment too. So right now, the thinking in science is that you have to have an ideal ecosystem for life. You know, you have to have so much oxygen, the anthropic principle, all of that, you know. The force fields have to be certain ratio, gravity, electromagnetism, and everything has to be in a precise mathematical ratio for an ecosystem or a biosphere to give rise to life. That's the current prevailing paradigm, as also the current prevailing paradigm in evolution is random mutations and natural selection. So, you know, here I have here in my hand a bunch of New Scientist magazine, looking at evolution, looking at the hard problem of consciousness, etc., but also looking at very fundamental things that you're talking about, precision nutrition, etc. All this coming together for a new story for humanity, for rethinking humanity. So, after we finish with you, we're talking to a photobiologist, and the photobiologists and other people that we've been speaking to, some of them say, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe the ecosystem and biosphere did not create life. Maybe life created the biosphere. And so we start with genetic information under the surface of the rainforest. And, we've done our work now. And it's apparent that even a teaspoon of soil under the Amazon has more genetic diversity than all of life on the surface of the earth. You go 1 inch under the surface of the earth and you find more genetic diversity for all of life, for other species. Tony was talking about innumerable proteins, more proteins than are in atoms in the universe. Well, what does that say? There's more actually sentience possible on this planet because those proteins are actually the product of genetic information. And genetic information gives rise to life, and life then projects itself as the biosphere. So that's a radical idea, but we're actually now working with a couple of organizations on rewilding cities with the right genetic information which resurrects life on this planet, maximum diversity of genetic information, which will also have huge implications for nutrition and life on this planet. So emergence happens, as you know, when there is maximum diversity of talent, maximum diversity of background, scientists, humanitarians, storytellers, entertainers, poets, musicians, dancers, philosophers, neuroscientists, cosmologists, and different ethnicities, maximum diversity, shared vision, and complementing each other's strengths. We have a new story emerging. And so what we'd like to propose is, as you continue with your foray in this huge endeavor to rethink humanity, that we work together to enlist maximum diversity of creativity, maximum diversity of cooperation, maximum diversity of storytelling. And if we do this properly, I think we could reach a critical mass without the help of world leaders, without the help of lobbyists, without the help of politicians, all gangsters anyway, and without the help of even special interest groups in business and pharmaceuticals, etc. There are many who would come along, including people we know in the pharmaceutical world, involved in the vaccines, etc., etc. So if you like this idea, let's put this conversation out into social media. Let's invite everyone to actually participate, give their opinion, and let's see how this evolves, because I'm seeing a very major disruption in human constructs themselves, including the very idea that we live in a physical world. And Tony said it, and I think I heard you say it, James, that the most valuable resource we have is imagination. So what is imagination? How does consciousness create an image? That's the wildest thing you can think of. I mean, I can imagine the Empire State Building. I can imagine the smell of my mother's skin. I can imagine John Lennon singing Imagine, all with an intention. And what is this thing we call imagination? How is it connected to creativity? If the raw material of the universe is consciousness, then let's go beyond all these conversations to actually harness the power of collective consciousness so we can reach a critical mass for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. If you're game for this, we have an adventure ahead of us.
Yeah, we're in for sure.
Well, any last comments from Tony, from James, from Poonacha before we put this out there and then we see how it evolves?
Yeah, so one thing that I want to mention to your point is that over the last 400 or 500 years, we've made incredible progress with linear thinking, physics, if you will. But what we're seeing now is that pretty much all of the most important challenges for humanity need complex thinking, right? I mean, it's all complex systems that need complex thinking to solve, whether it's climate, cancer, food, you name it, we need complex systems thinking to solve them. So in a way, we're talking about a cognitive revolution that we will need in order to take advantage, to capture the infinite possibility space. And as long as we do that, then we have a great chance to enable the age of freedom, which is at the end of the day, what we're talking about.
That's wonderful. Any comments, Jamie?
Yeah, no, I guess it's funny. Since we published the book, we've had a handful of governments and business leaders and reach out to us and say, can you tell us how to do it? Can you give us the action plan on how we get to the age of freedom? And we always say, well, no, we can't. It's about emergence. You can't. You're not going to sit in the room and plan. A, B, C. These are your moves. That's linear thinking. It's all about enabling the conditions. As you say, bringing all the people together with all the different ideas and perspectives and experimenting and trying things and seeing what happens and seeing what emerges, creating the conditions for this new system to emerge. And that's, that for me is critical. And it's, we've got to kind of resist our urges to organize and to plot a path. It's all about, creating the conditions for emergence for me.
Well, I'm so happy to hear that, because anything that's planned can't be an adventure.
I think just one thought I had was that talking about emergence, I was just reading this recent report on technologies. I never thought I would read a technology report like this. The top technologies are sun-powered chemistry, virtual patients, spatial computing, electric aviation, low-carbon cement, quantum sensing, green hydrogen, whole genome synthesis. And this is the top 10 technology report. So we are at a very unique time, right, to really bring and solve this together and co-create. But I have one question I want to ask you guys, just last question. Who will lead in the age of freedom? If you look at a looking glass.
I think the world will lead. The maximum diversity of creativity will lead, is my opinion. But go ahead.
Yeah. So leading civilizations have come from the edge, historically. Egypt was on the edge of the Sumerian Empire. Rome was on the edge of the Mediterranean empires. The UK was on the edge of the Roman Empire. America was on the edge of the British Empire, and so on. So we would expect the leading civilizations to come from the edge, not from the leaders, not from the US, not from Europe, not from China. But we do have an opportunity. So it'll come from Mumbai, it'll come from Israel, it'll come from Dubai or Singapore or Accra, but it won't necessarily come from the center, from the leading powers. And I think that the best way in which we can enable that emergence will be to devolve power from the center to the edge and start experimenting. We want 1,000 cities and regions, 10,000 cities and regions around the world to experiment and share what works and what doesn't work and so on, so that we can all co-evolve and make this emergent organizing system happen for the benefit of all mankind. But it's certainly not going to come from the center.